I never thought my own father would shove a suitcase into my chest on Christmas Eve and tell me to get out before I ruined the happiest night of his life. But that was exactly how it happened. One hard shove and one cold stare. Right after he signed a $300 million deal that was supposed to change everything for our family, except me. I remember the sound first. My mother's laugh from the kitchen had a sharp edge to it that night. It was the kind of laugh she only had when she thought she had finally won something. I had just finished a long shift reviewing vendor files for a temporary compliance job in downtown Phoenix. I pushed open the front door, expecting the warm glow of our usual Christmas Eve. Instead, the house felt like a conference room, buzzing with tension. My father, Charles Carter, was glued to his laptop in the dining room, phone pressed to his ear, pacing like a CEO in a final hour negotiation. My mother, Marilyn, moved around the kitchen with frantic energy, checking her phone every few seconds. I stood there with a grocery store bottle of wine in my hand and a knot already forming in my stomach. I had been out of work for 2 months after leaving my last compliance position over a disagreement about financial reporting. Tonight I hoped we could all just breathe for a moment. My father hung up the phone and gave me a nod that felt more like an interruption than a greeting. "You made it. Good. Dinner is almost ready." His voice carried no warmth. I stepped closer and saw a document still open on his laptop. The name North Crest Holdings jumped out at me, and below it the words "Acquisition Agreement" and $300 million. For a second I thought I read it wrong. Then I remembered the arguments from months before. The warnings I gave him about incomplete audit trails, inflated asset reports, and grant allocations that did not match fiscal records. He brushed me off then and told me my career issues had made me paranoid. I asked if the deal had gone through. He flashed a smile I had not seen since I was a kid. "Closed this afternoon. We are finally where we deserve to be." My mother joined with her tablet in hand. She started listing what they planned to buy after New Year. A house in Scottsdale, a boat in San Diego, a luxury trip to Italy. I just listened. The more they talked, the more my stomach tightened. I asked if their lawyers had verified the liability terms. For a second, the entire room froze. My father's smile faded. My mother's eyes narrowed like she had been waiting for something to ruin her mood. I tried to soften my voice. "I just mean that a deal this size comes with risk. North Crest is aggressive. Their CFO has been under review before. They might have slipped some exposure language into the fine print." My father slammed his laptop shut so hard the utensils on the table rattled. "There you go again, Logan. Always the pessimist. Always looking for shadows. Always thinking you know more than the people actually doing the work." I told him I was only trying to help. I reminded him that I used to handle compliance reviews at my old firm. But that only made him angrier. He stepped closer until I could smell the bourbon on his breath. "You quit that job or they fired you. Either way, you are not the one winning deals. You do not get a vote." My mother crossed her arms. "You show up with a cheap bottle of wine and start lecturing us. We are finally free of small thinking. Do not drag us down with you." The words hit harder than I expected. I tried to explain that I was not dragging anyone down. I just wanted them to be careful. My father cut me off. He said I had always been a weight around his neck. He said this deal proved he was right about me, that I lacked ambitions, that I lacked vision, that I never belonged in the world he was finally about to enter. He told me to put the wine on the counter. Then he pointed at my old room. "Pack your things. Tonight." My mother did not look at me. She just turned away and started humming along to some Christmas song playing on the speakers. My father walked into the hallway and came back with a suitcase already half filled with my clothes. He must have packed it earlier. Maybe they planned this. I stood there with the suitcase in my hands, trying to understand what was happening. I told him it was Christmas Eve. He did not even blink. This is our night, Logan. We refuse to let you ruin it. He pushed me toward the door. Not violent, but firm enough to tell me there was no use resisting. I tried one last time. I said we were family, and families talk. My father said we stopped being a family the day I decided I knew better than them. He opened the front door, and the cold night air rushed in. My mother followed and placed my winter jacket on top of the suitcase like she was handing a stranger a lost item. She did not say a word. I stepped outside. The sky was clear, and the street looked like every Christmas Eve from my childhood. Except now I was standing in it, alone. My father said good luck in a tone that made it clear he did not mean it. Then the door closed. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, trying to breathe. I had nowhere to go. The friends I used to rely on had families of their own, and I did not want to ruin their holiday. The buses were running, but barely. I sat on the curb and stared at the suitcase beside me. My hands shook, but not from the cold. I finally called a rideshare and asked to be taken to the cheapest motel on the south side of Phoenix. The driver did not talk much, and I was grateful. The lights of the city blurred past the window, and everything inside my chest felt numb. When we arrived at the motel, the parking lot was half empty, and the neon sign flickered like it was dying. I paid for a week using the last of my savings and climbed the stairs to a second-floor room that smelled faintly of cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my jacket, and just listened to the hum of the old heater. It hit me then with full weight. I had been thrown out of my own home on Christmas Eve, not because I did anything wrong, but because my parents had become exactly the kind of people I had spent years warning them not to trust. People who thought money erased everything. I lay back on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. The wine bottle was still in my hand, and I set it on the nightstand. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. Slow, heavy, confused. Outside my window, a couple laughed as they passed by, muffled by the cold air. Life kept moving even if mine had stopped for a moment. I closed my eyes and told myself I would figure something out in the morning. But I did not know then that the real shock, the thing that would change everything, had not even arrived yet. Morning light crept through the thin motel curtains and landed square on my face, pulling me out of a shallow sleep that left my head heavy and my mouth dry. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then the smell of old carpet and bleach reminded me. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, listening to the pipes clicking in the walls as someone in another room ran water. The cheap clock on the nightstand said 12. Christmas morning. I pulled on my jacket and stepped outside. The air was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that makes you breathe deeper just to feel something. A few families were loading gifts into cars, kids laughing, parents calling after them. I felt like a ghost drifting through someone else's life. I walked down the metal stairs, bought a small coffee from the front counter, and wandered toward the main road. I had no plan, just movement. My phone vibrated in my pocket. For a moment, my heart kicked up, thinking my parents had come to their senses. But the screen showed a Phoenix area code I did not recognize. I let it ring out. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared, followed by a text from the same number. Logan Carter. Your presence is required to finalize compliance disclosures for the Northcrest Holdings acquisition. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. That made no sense. My father had made it clear he did not want me involved. I played the voicemail. A woman's voice came on, crisp and corporate. Mr. Carter, this is Dawn from the legal office at Northcrest. We need your signature on a previous review document you handled 3 years ago. It concerns grant allocations and asset restructuring. Please call back today. Our records show you previously flagged several discrepancies that we need to verify before the merger filing. I felt my stomach twist. 3 years ago, I had worked on a small audit for a subsidiary connected to North Crest. The internal reports during that time had been a mess. It was one reason I left that job. But I never expected those old notes to resurface, let alone during a $300 million deal involving my father. I listened again, slower this time. They were asking for my signature because my old report had flagged issues. If North Crest needed that on Christmas morning, it meant they had found something big. It also meant the entire acquisition could be exposed to liability if the inconsistencies traced back to the subsidiary my father was now tied to. I called back. A man answered this time, sounding slightly out of breath. "Mr. Carter, thanks for returning the call. We are trying to verify your findings on the Brindle Creek restructuring. We understand you previously reported inflation in projected assets for environmental grants." I tried to keep my voice steady. That was years ago. The department shut down before I could finish the review. "Why are you contacting me now?" He lowered his voice like someone might overhear. "Because your notes were never cleared, and they match a new set of inconsistencies we found in North Crest's acquisition documents. We need to confirm whether you formally certified the review." I stepped into the shadow of a closed laundromat and pressed my back against the wall. I never certified anything. I wrote a preliminary note, that was all. The man cursed under his breath. "Then we have a problem. Someone certified those files using your old ID number. And the discrepancies match the same kind of inflation patterns that could void the merger." I blinked hard, unsure if I heard correctly. "You are saying someone forged my signature? Why would they do that?" He hesitated. "They needed the numbers to match projected value. If they did not, the contract payout would be reduced or denied. You see where this is going?" My pulse thudded in my ears. If the acquisition collapsed because of fraudulent asset certifications, my father and his partners could face legal fallout, civil penalties, investigations. Everything they celebrated last night could unravel. The man continued. "We need you to come into the office tomorrow to verify your statement, officially. Bring ID. This could become messy." We hung up, and I stood there staring at the cracked pavement. My father had thrown me out hours earlier, called me a weight, a problem, and yet here was a storm headed straight for him. The exact kind of storm I warned him about. For a long moment, I just walked. I did not look at the street signs, or the cars, or the Christmas banners still hanging from the light poles. I kept thinking about that suitcase in my hands the night before. The deadbolt sliding shut. The sound of their laughter before the door closed. By noon, I found myself at a small diner near the freeway. I sat at the counter and ordered scrambled eggs and toast, but I mostly pushed the food around the plate. A TV above the soda machine played muted holiday commercials. I kept replaying the phone call, forged signatures, inflated assets. My father signing off on everything without bothering to check. My phone rang again. I almost didn't answer, but something in me said, "Pick it up." It was my cousin Vince calling from Mesa. I had not heard from him in months. I answered, and he jumped in without waiting. "Logan, man, what happened last night? Your parents were bragging all over Facebook. They said they landed some huge contract and were celebrating without you." I stared at the napkin I had been tearing into small pieces. "They kicked me out." Silence. Then a low whistle. "On Christmas Eve." "Damn, that is cold." I told him a short version of what happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "They are acting like they hit the lottery. Everyone is talking about it." I hesitated. "There might be a problem with the deal. North Crest called me this morning." He swore softly. "You think they know something is off?" "I do not know yet. He gave me the address of his warehouse in Mesa. Said he had a small spare room if I needed a place to stay for a week or two. I thanked him. It was the first kind moment I had felt since this whole nightmare began. After we hung up, I paid the bill and stepped outside. The sun was bright, but it did not warm anything. I walked back to the motel, packed my few things, and checked out. I dragged the suitcase across the lot and waited for a rideshare. A car pulled up. I gave the driver the Mesa address and sat back as we merged onto the 60. The city unfolded outside my window. Strip malls, billboards, holiday traffic. I tried to imagine what my father was doing at that exact moment. Probably bragging about the deal to everyone he knew. Probably celebrating the life he thought he finally earned. But if Northcrest was digging into those forged records, they would eventually dig into his paperwork too. And the truth had a way of finding people who thought they were too smart to get caught. The freeway hummed beneath the tires. For the first time since the night before, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something quieter. A sense that whatever was coming toward my parents was not something I caused. It was something they had built themselves. The car turned off the exit and headed toward the industrial district where my cousin's warehouse sat behind a chain-link fence. I told myself I just needed a few days to breathe. A few days to think before meeting with Northcrest's legal team. But even as I stepped out of the car and grabbed my suitcase, I could not shake the feeling that something bigger was already in motion, something none of us were prepared for. I took a final look at the fading daylight over the rooftops, then headed toward the warehouse door. Vince opened the warehouse door before I even knocked. He looked like he had rolled straight out of bed. Hair messy, hoodie half-zipped, but his eyes were sharp the moment he saw me dragging that suitcase. "You look like hell," he said, stepping aside so I could enter. I told him he did not look much better. He snorted and slapped my shoulder. "That is the Logan I know. Come on. Spare room is upstairs." The warehouse smelled like engine oil and dust. The scent of a place where people fix things with their hands instead of contracts and signatures. Vince rented it for his online parts business, mostly motorcycle and old truck restorations. Rows of metal shelves stretched down the main floor stacked with boxes, carburetors, and greasy engines waiting for resurrection. Upstairs, the spare room was small but clean. A narrow bed, a dresser, a small window that looked out onto the lot. The mattress was better than the motel's by a mile. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed while Vince leaned against the doorway. "You want to talk about what happened?" he asked. I gave him the whole story. My father's deal, the celebration, the arguments, the suitcase shoved into my arms, the deadbolt sliding shut. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked a few times. Vince did not interrupt. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Your folks always had sharp edges, but this is a different level. I cannot believe they did that on Christmas Eve." I nodded slowly. It still felt unreal hearing someone else say it. I told him about the call from Northcrest, too. About the forged signature and the discrepancies resurfacing from years ago. He rubbed the back of his neck. "That sounds serious. If someone used your ID to certify shady numbers, they are not small-timers. You need to watch your back." I told him I planned to meet the legal team the next morning. He asked if I wanted company. I told him I would be fine. He did not look convinced, but he let it go. I unpacked a few shirts and left the rest in my suitcase. After settling in, we headed downstairs. Vince made coffee while I stood by the large sliding door watching the sun dip behind the industrial buildings. For a moment, I wished things could slow down. Then my phone buzzed. "Unknown number," I answered cautiously. A man's voice came through, calm but heavy, like someone who had been repeating the same line all day. "Mr. Carter, this is Lieutenant Hale with the Financial Crimes Division of the Arizona Attorney General's office. We received a report this morning regarding irregularities in the Northcrest acquisition documents. My throat tightened. What kind of irregularities? He paused like he expected me to run. Several key certifications tied to asset valuations are under review. Your name appears on 2 of them. We will need to confirm your involvement. I gripped the counter to steady myself. Sir, I did not certify anything. Those signatures are forged. I told Northcrest this morning. There was a beat of silence. Lieutenant Hale spoke again, lower this time. Then you need to be very careful. Fraud cases of this size attract attention. If your name is involved anywhere, you need to protect yourself. Do not speak to anyone from the acquisition team without counsel present. Not even family. Family. The word stung. I asked if my father was under investigation. He gave the official line. I cannot comment on that at this stage. But you should know that the state takes forged certifications seriously. We will contact you again soon. He hung up. My hands shook as I lowered the phone. Vince noticed immediately. What happened now? Financial Crimes Division called. They know about the forged signatures. His eyes widened. So this thing is bigger than your dad's deal. Someone is trying to bury something and used your name as a shield. I nodded. The room felt smaller and hotter. Whoever did this is not done. If they forged my signature, once they might try to twist things to make me look complicit. Vince poured me coffee and pushed the mug into my hands. Sit, drink, breathe. You are not alone in this. For a few minutes, we just sat there. The warehouse was quiet except for the hum of a small space heater near the workbench. My thoughts kept circling the same fear. If the deal blew up, my parents would blame me. They already thought I was the problem. If they found out the investigation tied back to old reports I had written, they would twist it into my fault, even if it was meant to protect them. Vince stood. Come on, let us get some food in you. We headed to a small burger place a few blocks away. The kind of joint that had faded menus and Christmas lights still hanging from Halloween nails. We sat in a booth near the window. A TV above the counter played local news. I was halfway through my burger when the anchor's voice caught my attention. Northcrest Holdings announced the closing of a major acquisition yesterday. Some analysts are calling the move risky due to unanswered questions in previous financial disclosures. I froze mid-bite. Vince watched the screen too. The anchor continued. Representatives from the state's Financial Oversight Division have not commented, but sources indicate an internal review is underway. They moved on to another story. My burger went cold. Vince exhaled. That is how you know it is real. If it made the news, then phones are ringing in offices all over the city right now. I swallowed hard. Tomorrow is going to be a mess. We finished dinner quietly and walked back to the warehouse. The streets were mostly empty, Christmas lights blinking in slow pulses across dark storefront windows. When we got inside, Vince locked the door and set the alarm. I went upstairs and tried to read something on my phone to distract myself. But my mind kept replaying the voices from the day. The Northcrest legal team, the financial crimes officer, my father's cold stare as he shoved the suitcase into my arms. I lay down and stared at the ceiling. The warehouse creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. I closed my eyes, but sleep would not come. Every time I drifted, I imagined someone knocking on the warehouse door or my phone lighting up with another unknown number. Sometime after midnight, I finally dozed off. It felt like only minutes later when my phone vibrated again. I grabbed it, half awake. A text message from my mother. Stop whatever you are doing. We need to talk. Now. I sat up straight. My chest tightened like someone was squeezing it from the inside. I waited for a second message. Nothing came. I stared at the screen, the glow lighting the dark room. A knot formed in my stomach, the kind that told me something had already gone wrong in their world. And I was about to be pulled right back into it whether I wanted to or not. I did not text her back. I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then I locked the screen and set the phone face down on the nightstand. Sleep came in short, broken pieces after that, more like passing out and snapping awake than any real rest. Each time I opened my eyes, I half expected another message to be waiting, or a string of missed calls. But the screen stayed dark. Near dawn, a strip of gray light slid in around the blinds. I sat up, feet on the floor, and listened to the quiet of the warehouse around me. The metal frame creaked when the wind hit it just right. Somewhere below, a compressor kicked on and off. For the first time since I was a kid, the silence of a holiday morning did not mean peace. It just meant nobody knew what was coming yet. I pulled on jeans and a clean shirt, splashed water on my face in the tiny bathroom, and opened the door to the hallway. An envelope lay flat on the floor outside, perfectly centered like someone had measured the distance. No address, no postage, no logo, just my name in neat blue ink. My first thought was that my parents had sent someone. My second thought was that if they did, they would not be this subtle. I picked it up, turned it over, and went back into the room before opening it. Inside were three things. The first was a photocopy of the Northcrest acquisition agreement, or at least the first few pages. Several sections were circled in red pen, the ink pressed hard enough to dent the paper. Phrases like material misrepresentation, clawback of consideration, and personal guarantor stood out like warning sirens. The second was a short note in the same blue ink that had written my name on the front. You need counsel who is not being paid by Northcrest or Carter Dynamics. Call me before you sign anything. The third was a business card. Evelyn Ward, Senior Corporate Counsel, a downtown Phoenix address, and a cell number. I sat on the bed with the card between my fingers. The name meant nothing to me. But the fact that she knew about my involvement before I even stepped into a conference room made my skin prickle. I checked the time. It was barely past 7. The call with Northcrest was at 9. I stared at the card for another full minute. Then I dialed. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that spent a lot of time in boardrooms. You got my envelope? Yes. I looked at the pages again. How did you know where to find me? She let that sit for a second. I know people in the Attorney General office. I heard your name before they called you. You were registered as the original reviewer on a flagged file. Someone used your credentials after you left. That puts you in the blast radius, whether you want to be there or not. I swallowed. And you decided to hand-deliver a warning. You would not have believed an email, she said. And I did not want your parents intercepting it. So she knew my parents, too. I asked her how. I used to work at Carter Dynamics. Logan? She hesitated, then added, until your mother and father pushed me out when I would not sign off on their numbers. The room seemed to tilt a little. I pressed my free hand into the mattress. Why contact me now? Because Northcrest is protecting Northcrest, she said. Carter Dynamics is protecting Carter Dynamics. No one is focused on protecting you. And I have seen this movie before. The scapegoat is usually the one who warned them in the first place. I breathed out slowly. I have a meeting with their legal team at 9. Then meet me at 8 at Copper Spoon on 7th and McDowell. It is on the way. 10 minutes is all I ask. After that, you can walk into any conference room you want. But at least you will know what you are up against. She did not push. She just waited. I found myself nodding even though she could not see it. All right, 8. We hung up. For a long moment I sat there hearing my heartbeat. Evelyn had just confirmed what my gut already suspected. People with 300 million on the line were not going to shrug and say mistakes happen. They were going to find someone to blame. and my name was already in their files. By the time I went downstairs, Vince was at the workbench sorting packages. He looked up. Sleep any better? Not really. I held up the business card. Got a visitor. He raised an eyebrow while I explained. By the time I finished, he shook his head. So now we have mystery lawyers dropping documents at your door before the sun comes up. That is not ominous at all. I told him about the meeting at the coffee shop. He offered to drive, but I said I would take my own car. It felt important to walk into this on my own 2 feet. The streets were mostly empty when I pulled into the lot behind Copper Spoon. The coffee shop sat on the corner of an older strip. Brick facade and large windows that reflected the pale morning light. Inside, a handful of people hunched over laptops, headphones in, faces lit by screens. I spotted her at a corner table. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, navy blazer over a black blouse, no jewelry except a slim watch. She had the kind of tired eyes you only get from too many years of reading contracts under bad lighting. She stood when I approached and offered a hand. Her grip was firm. "You look more like an engineer than the villain in a fraud case." She said, "Sit." I managed a weak laugh and sat across from her. A file folder sat open on the table. Pages fanned out, my name visible on at least 2 of them. She slid one page toward me. "Do you recognize this?" It was the old Brindle Creek review from my previous job. My notes, my formatting, my flagged items. At the bottom, a certification line with my name typed under it and a signature that looked too neat to be mine. "That is not me," I said. She nodded. "I know. We pulled your employment records. You left 3 months before this was executed. But the signature kept the file alive. It let them roll questionable assets into the valuation that Northcrest later used to justify $300 million. I stared at the paper, and my parents signed off on this valuation. She tapped another page, this one from the new acquisition agreement. Their names sat neatly next to wording that promised they had reviewed all underlying assets and disclosures, that no material misrepresentation existed to the best of their knowledge. "They will say they relied on the numbers," she said, "that they did not know about any issues. And Northcrest will say they relied on internal certifications like this one." She tapped my forged signature again. All that finger-pointing has to land somewhere. My mouth felt dry. I took a sip of coffee and it did not help. I asked her about her time at Carter Dynamics. Her jaw tightened a fraction as she talked. She had joined 6 years earlier, helped them navigate a rough audit, cleaned up their compliance procedures. When the company started chasing bigger deals, the shortcuts returned. She documented what she could. But when she refused to sign off on a particular quarter, my mother and father met with the board without her. After that, she was offered a quiet exit and a small severance. "Take it and move on. They do not like people who say no," she said simply. That part I already knew. I asked her if she was the one who tipped off the state and federal offices. She did not answer directly, but the way she looked at me told me enough. "I learned something early in my career," she said. "The system is slow, but it does not forget. You can bury a bad number for a while, but when someone starts pulling threads, everything connected to it comes up too. Someone at Northcrest started pulling threads, and here we are." I sat back. "So what do I do when I walk in there at 9? Her reply came quick. "You do not sign anything. You confirm that you alerted your previous employer to inconsistencies. You state clearly that you were gone before any issue or any certification was attached to your name. And if they offer you representation, you politely decline and tell them you will seek your own counsel." I frowned. Why refuse their lawyer? Because any lawyer paid by Northcrest or Carter Dynamics has one job: minimize their client's exposure. Not yours? I thought of my father telling me I had no vote, my mother calling me negative, the suitcase pressing into my chest. For a second, anger flared again. Not hot this time, but heavy and metallic, like realizing you had been carrying weight for years without knowing it. Evelyn closed the folder. One more thing. When the regulators come, and they will, they may treat you as a potential witness or as someone they need to pressure. You are in a better position if you come forward willingly. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. I looked down. Unknown number. Washington, D.C. area code. She nodded toward it. You might want to take that. I stepped outside into the cool air and answered. A measured male voice came on. Mr. Carter, my name is Samuel Ortega. I am with the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I believe you have already spoken with your State Attorney General office. We are coordinating with them. My throat tightened. Yes, I talked to someone yesterday. We have reviewed preliminary reports that include your name on internal certifications and prior audit notes. Based on what we see, there is a high probability that your credentials were used without authorization. That makes you a person of interest, but not necessarily a target. Do you understand the difference? I said I thought I did. He continued. We will likely issue a formal request for your cooperation. In the meantime, do not destroy any records. Do not sign any documents related to the acquisition. And do not discuss the details of your old reports with representatives of Northcrest or Carter Dynamics without independent counsel present. That includes your parents. The way he said parents made it clear he already knew the whole family tree. I leaned against the brick wall of the cafe. Are my parents under investigation? He gave the same line I had heard from the state officer. But there was something harder underneath it. I cannot comment on specific individuals at this stage. I can tell you that the transaction and the underlying valuations are under active review. Your cooperation can help clarify your position. We spoke a few minutes more. He explained the process in dry, careful language, subpoenas, interviews, timelines. When we hung up, I stood there staring at the phone. Behind the glass, Evelyn watched me with a look that mixed professional distance with something like pity. Cars rolled past on McDowell, the sky clearing to a pale winter blue. In the span of 2 days, I had gone from being the family disappointment to sitting in the crosshairs of a federal review that could take down the deal my parents had staked their future on. And for the first time, I understood that whatever happened next was no longer just about hurt feelings or a suitcase on a sidewalk. It was about whose name would be left holding the weight when the numbers finally collapsed. I walked back inside the cafe, and Evelyn was already gathering her papers. She did not ask what the call was about. She could read it on my face. She slipped the folder into her briefcase and stood. You have 30 minutes until your meeting. Whatever they try to sell you, remember what I said. Protect yourself. I thanked her, and she nodded once, sharp and final, then left through the side door. I watched her cross the parking lot before I turned toward my car. The air felt heavier than before, like the city was waking up with a headache. I drove toward downtown without turning on the radio, both hands tight on the wheel. Every red light felt like someone tapping the brakes on my nerves. Northcrest's offices sat on the 23rd floor of a glass tower off Central Avenue. I walked through the rotating doors and felt the temperature drop instantly. The air inside smelled like cold metal and strong coffee. A receptionist directed me to a conference room. She did not smile. She looked at me like I was already a problem waiting to happen. I stepped inside and found 3 people at the long table. 2 men in suits, 1 woman in a blazer. The man at the head of the table introduced himself as Mark Avery. He had the polished look of someone who slept fine even on the worst days. The woman beside him introduced herself as Clara from compliance. The third was a younger man who never gave his name, just nodded and tapped something quietly on a tablet. We took our seats. Mark folded his hands. Thank you for coming in. Logan, we know this is short notice. We appreciate your cooperation. I remembered Evelyn's warning. I kept my tone neutral. You said you had questions about my former work. Clara slid a printed packet toward me. It showed the Brindle Creek documents, my notes, and the forged certifications. She asked if I could confirm the handwriting was not mine. I nodded. She asked if I ever completed the certification steps. I told her I left the department before that phase. She asked if anyone had access to my unlocked workstation during my final month. I told her yes. Half the team used shared terminals during crunch weeks. She nodded as if that matched something she already knew. Then Mark leaned forward. His voice softened like he was trying to sound like a mentor. We are not here to accuse you of anything. We want to understand the timeline. The state has asked for clarity. So has the federal side. We need to confirm that your review did not raise concerns that would impact the valuation of Carter Dynamics at the time. I took a slow breath. My notes clearly flagged inconsistencies. That is why I brought them to my supervisor before I left. The younger man across from me stopped tapping his tablet. All three looked at me. Mark cleared his throat. And how did your supervisor respond? I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. He asked me to leave the file on his desk. The department shut down a few weeks later. I assumed they handled it. Clara scribbled something. Mark spoke again. Lower this time. Logan, deals like this involve many people. There are misunderstandings. We want this resolved quietly and cleanly. If you sign a statement confirming that you had no reason to believe the numbers were materially flawed, we can move this process along. There it was. The trap Evelyn warned me about. I kept my expression still. I cannot sign anything until I speak with independent counsel. Mark's smile flickered for the first time. Independent counsel is unnecessary and will complicate things. You are not under investigation. You are a material witness. Signing this protects you. It protects you, I thought. Not me. I pushed the packet back toward them. I will wait for my counsel. He exhaled through his nose. For a second, the polished exterior cracked. Then he recovered and closed the file neatly. Very well. We will follow up. The meeting ended faster after that. They walked me to the elevator with polite smiles that felt colder than the marble floor. I stepped outside into the sun and felt sweat on my palms, even though the air was crisp. By the time I got back to Vince's warehouse, my phone had 3 missed calls from my mother and 2 from my father. I let them sit. I was not ready to hear whatever version of panic they were living in. Vince was packing orders when I walked in. He looked up. How bad was it? I told him everything. He let out a low whistle, the same one he made the first night I arrived. He set a box aside and wiped his hands. So they wanted you to sign a clean bill of health on those numbers. Figures. They need a scapegoat with a pulse. But you did good saying no. I sat on a metal stool near the workbench and rubbed my face with both hands. I could feel a headache coming on. Before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my father. Answer your phone, right now. I put it face down on the workbench. Vince raised an eyebrow. You gonna call them back? Not yet. Maybe not ever. He nodded slowly. Then he slid over a bottle of water. You might want this. You look like you swallowed a lightning bolt. I tried to laugh, but it came out as a short breath. My nerves were shot. I needed air. I stepped outside into the lot behind the warehouse. The sky had cleared, a bright winter blue stretching over the buildings. For a moment, just a small one, I let myself breathe. I barely heard the door open behind me. Thought I would find you out here, Vince said, handing me my jacket. You left without it. I slipped it on, grateful for the warmth. He leaned against the railing beside me. Logan, you know your parents are going to try something. They always do. after what you just told me. I would bet money they are calling everyone they know trying to find a way to clean this up. And if they cannot clean it up, they will point fingers. Probably at you. I knew he was right. I had seen it my whole life. When things went wrong, they looked for someone to blame long before they looked for a solution. Vince nudged my arm. You need a plan, not just for tomorrow or next week. For what happens if the state or SEC pulls you deeper into this mess. You need a lawyer who fights for you, not for them. I thought of the envelope outside my door, the neat handwriting, the warning, Evelyn's steady voice. I already met someone who can help. He nodded. Good. Then stick with her. People who warn you before dawn are either crazy or loyal. Either way, you need that right now. I almost smiled. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail notification. My mother. I stared at the screen but did not press play. Inside the warehouse, machinery hummed softly. A forklift beeped. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed across the industrial blocks. Life moved even when yours felt like it was freezing in place. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I was not ready to deal with my parents. Not yet. I needed to keep my footing first. Vince clapped my shoulder once, solid and grounding. Come on. I have a spare sandwich in the fridge that might be edible. You need food before you pass out. We went back inside. I ate without tasting much. After lunch, I tried to distract myself by helping pack a few orders. It did not work. My thoughts kept drifting back to the forged signature, the voicemail from the SEC, and the way Mark's smile had thinned when I refused to sign. By late afternoon, I was exhausted in a way that sat deep in my bones. I went upstairs to rest. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling until my eyes blurred. Just as I started to drift, muffled footsteps echoed up the metal stairs. A voice followed. Logan, there is someone here asking for you. I sat up slowly. My pulse kicked hard. Who? I asked. Vince hesitated. His face was tight in a way I did not like. Your father. I froze with one leg still hanging off the bed. For a moment I thought I misheard him. Vince rarely looked uneasy, but right then he looked like someone who had just opened a door and found a rattlesnake coiled on the welcome mat. He is downstairs, he said quietly. He's not yelling or anything. But he looks bad. Really bad. My stomach tightened. The last time I saw my father. He shoved a suitcase at me and locked me out of his house on Christmas Eve. Now he was standing in an industrial warehouse in Mesa, like a man searching for shelter he did not deserve. I stood, wiped my palms on my jeans, and followed Vince down the metal stairs. Each step rang louder than it needed to, echoing through the open space. I spotted my father near the center of the warehouse. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, dark circles pressed under his eyes. The man who had celebrated a $300 million deal less than 2 days ago now looked like he had aged 10 years. He turned when he heard me. His voice cracked on the first word. Logan. I did not answer. I waited. He stepped closer. His movements were stiff, like each step cost him something. I half expected him to launch into anger or blame. But instead he swallowed hard and spoke again. We need to talk. Please. The word please hung in the air like it did not belong in his mouth. Vince stayed near the workbench, arms crossed, ready to intervene if he needed to. I kept my distance. What do you want? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hand shook as he held it out. Read it. I did not move. You can tell me. He exhaled sharply, frustrated that I was not making this easy for him. But he still did not raise his voice. That alone told me how desperate he was. The deal, the acquisition. Northcrest is backing away. Their lawyers sent a notice late last night. They said they found inconsistencies that were not disclosed. They said the valuation may have relied on fraudulent certifications. They told us they might renegotiate or walk entirely. I let him talk. He paced once, stopped, and ran a hand through his messy hair. Your mother is terrified. The board is panicking. The house we put a deposit on is already on hold. Banks are calling about the credit lines we pulled. Everything is falling apart. I need to know what you told them. The anger in his voice returned for a split second, like he wanted to snap back into the old role. Then he visibly forced himself to calm down. I did not tell them anything. I said, they already knew. I just confirmed what was true. He closed his eyes for a moment, jaw tightening. Then he stepped closer. Logan, this could ruin us. Ruin your mother. Ruin the company. If the SEC is involved, this could drag on for years. We need to show we acted in good faith. If you would sign a statement saying you never found serious issues, that you trusted the numbers, it would help all of us. There it was again. The same trap, just from a different mouth. I shook my head. I am not signing anything. I told you that 2 days ago and I meant it. His voice rose. You are being stubborn. You do not understand what is at stake. I took a step toward him. No. You do not understand what is at stake. Someone forged my signature. Someone used my credentials. And instead of worrying about the crime, you are worrying about your reputation. He flinched like I had slapped him. For a second, something behind his eyes cracked open. Maybe guilt. Maybe fear. Maybe he finally realized the world he built was made of thinner glass than he thought. I told him about the meeting with Northcrest, about the request to sign a false confirmation, about the call from the SEC. His face drained of color at the mention of the federal investigation. He sat down heavily on a nearby crate, elbows on his knees, fingers pressing into his temples. I should have checked the numbers, he muttered. I thought everything was clean. I thought we were finally moving up. I thought this was our chance. I felt anger rise again. Our chance. You kicked me out of the house so you could celebrate without me. Remember? You shoved my suitcase at me and locked the door. Do not pretend we were doing this together. He winced. I know I handled things badly. That line was so soft, so thin, so unlike him that for a moment I was not sure what to do with it. He lifted his head, his voice roughened. Your mother wants to see you. She is in the car. Vince stiffened. I did too. Why? I asked. He swallowed. She wants to apologize. I almost laughed. My mother never apologized for anything in her life. Not when she was wrong. Not when she knew she was wrong. Not when she hurt someone on purpose. I followed him toward the warehouse entrance anyway. Vince walked beside me like a shadow. Outside, a dark blue sedan idled near the loading ramp. My mother sat in the passenger seat, hands clenched around her phone. When she saw me, she opened the door slowly. Her eyes were red, but not from crying, more from not sleeping. She stepped out and approached me with careful, measured steps. We need your help, Logan. Not I am sorry. Not we were wrong. Not what we did was unforgivable. Just help us. I felt something cold settle in my chest. She reached for my arm like she wanted to make the moment softer. I stepped back. Her hand froze in midair. We are desperate, she said. The bank called this morning. The partners are threatening to pull out. We need someone who can talk to the state investigators and clarify that you never meant to imply the asset numbers were wrong. You can say they were incomplete, or preliminary, or that you did not remember exactly what you found. You want me to lie? She did not blink. You want us all to go down. The accusation hit like a punch. Like I was the one who forged signatures. Like I was the one who buried the warnings. I felt the cold inside me harden. For years I let them twist things. For years I carried the weight so they could feel lighter, but not this time. I will not lie for you, I said. My father stepped forward. Logan, listen. You do not understand what happens if this collapses. We could lose everything. The house, the company, our retirement. Your mother could face charges. I could face charges. I looked at him until he stopped talking. I warned you about these numbers months ago. You called me paranoid. I tried to help. You pushed me out. You kicked me out on Christmas Eve. And now you want me to clean up a mess I did not make. My mother's face twisted. She did not like hearing the truth spoken back at her. She tried one last tactic, the low one. We are still your parents. We raised you. You owe us something. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. If you believe that, then you never understood me at all. She inhaled sharply. My father placed a hand on her arm. She pulled it away and stepped closer to me, voice breaking in the worst way. If you don't help us, they will blame us for everything. They will tear us apart. Logan, do you understand that? They will tear our lives apart. Her voice shook not from sorrow, but from fear. Raw fear of consequences, fear of losing status, fear of being exposed. And for the first time, I saw them clearly. Not as parents, not as family, but as two people who cared more about appearances than truth. Two people who would sacrifice anyone to protect themselves, even their own son. I stepped back, and I heard myself say the words that had been building since the night they threw me out. You chose this, not me. My mother sucked in a breath like she had been slapped. My father's shoulders dropped. I turned to go back inside the warehouse, but just before I reached the door, my father spoke again, voice low and broken. You are making a mistake. Logan, a big one. You think these investigators are on your side? They are not. When this blows up, they will look at every signature, every file, every person connected to the discrepancies. And who do you think they will come after first? The son who flagged the problems, or the executives who signed the contract? I did not turn around. He kept talking, desperation creeping into his voice. You think you are safe? You are not. You are standing on the same cliff we are. And if we fall, you fall too. I paused just long enough to feel his words hit. Not because I believed him, but because they confirmed how far he was willing to go. Then I opened the warehouse door, stepped inside, and let it shut behind me. My pulse hammered in my ears. They had shown their true cards. They were not here to apologize. They were here to drag me down with them. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something I had not dared to admit until now. They might actually try. I stood just inside the warehouse door for a long moment, letting the cool air settle around me while my pulse slowly stopped hammering in my ears. Vince watched from across the floor. He did not ask what happened. He could tell from my face. He just walked over, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said he would lock up once my parents left the lot. I went upstairs to the spare room and closed the door. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, staring at the floor until my vision blurred. I could still hear my father's voice in my head. If we fall, you fall too. It stuck like a thorn. Not because it was true, but because it told me exactly what they were planning. They would lie to investigators. They would point fingers. They would twist my warnings into accusations. They would do anything to survive. I sat there until the sound of their car engine faded from the parking lot. Only then did the tightness in my chest start to loosen. I needed air. I grabbed my jacket and went downstairs. Vince looked up from sealing a shipping box. They are gone, he said. Good. You want to talk about it? Not yet. He nodded. He understood that not yet really meant the pressure was too high and the words were not ready to come out. I stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The sun was sliding lower, painting the industrial buildings in long shadows. I walked toward the back of the lot where an old concrete loading ramp overlooked a drainage ditch. That was where I stood when the first week here started to feel less like a collapse and more like a pause. But now, even that small comfort felt threatened. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I flinched. I expected another message from my parents. Instead, it was an unknown number with a 206 Seattle area code. I nearly let it ring out, but something inside me said answer. I pressed the phone to my ear. "Is this Logan Carter?" "Yes." The voice was calm and measured, but not hostile. More curious than anything. "My name is Connor Reyes. I work as an investigative reporter with the Sentinel-Ledger. I am looking into irregularities connected to the North Crest acquisition. Your name keeps coming up in documents I have reviewed." My stomach tightened again, but not with fear this time, with expectation. Evelyn had warned me that as soon as one thread was pulled, others would follow. "Where did you get my number?" I asked. "From publicly available filings," he said. "And from someone who suggested you might have information that matters." That someone had to be Evelyn. I did not answer right away. He continued before I could. "Look, I am not calling to complicate your life. I know the SEC is involved. I know the state is involved. I am not asking for anything confidential. I just want context. A timeline. Something that helps me understand how a valuation this big gets built on numbers that were never properly certified." I sat on the ramp, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the gravel between my shoes. "I cannot talk about specifics," I said. "Not now." "That is fine," he said. "I figured you would say that. But hear me out. I have been covering financial misconduct cases for 15 years. Deals like this do not implode because of one forged signature. They implode because the people at the top pretend not to know what they knew, and someone always pays for that silence." He paused, then added softly, "Do not let that someone be you." His words hit deeper than I expected. I let out a breath. "Why are you really calling?" "Because in cases like this, truth wins eventually. I like talking to the people who see it first." Another pause. Then he said something that tightened the space in my chest. "Also, your parents are giving statements to the press. They are saying you misunderstood your old work, that you are confused, that you are not well." My hands clenched around the phone. "So they already started?" "Yes," he said. "They are trying to get ahead of the narrative. And if the deal fails, they will try even harder." I rubbed my forehead, drained and angry. What exactly did they say? He read 2 short lines from a statement. Hearing my mother's words through a stranger's voice felt like someone twisting a knife. "Your parents are in a panic," he said. "They think you are the weak link. But that is only true if you stay quiet. When you are ready to talk, call me back. I am not your enemy." He hung up. I stared at the phone, jaw tight, trying to decide whether to scream or laugh. They were losing their fortune, and their response was to paint me as unstable. It was predictable and cruel, and so them that I should not have been surprised. I walked back inside. Vince was stacking boxes on a pallet. When he saw my face, he stopped. "You got another call?" A reporter. His eyebrows shot up. "That is fast." He said my parents are already giving statements. They are saying I am confused. Vince let out a long breath. "So that is their plan. If things collapse, they make you the naive son who misunderstood something, a kid who blew things out of proportion." I sat heavily on a crate. "I am 34 years old and they are calling me a kid." He grabbed a rag and wiped grease off his hands. "They are scared. Logan. Scared people do stupid things. And your parents were pretty good at stupid things even before fear was added to the mix." I exhaled slowly. "You ever think there is a point where a family is not a family anymore? Just people tied together by a last name. He shrugged. Sometimes blood is the thinnest bond in the room. We stayed like that for a few minutes. The warehouse hummed quietly, machines cooling down behind us. The silence felt heavy but not crushing. As evening settled in, Vince suggested grabbing dinner. I told him I needed a little time alone. He nodded and said he would bring back something for later. When he left, the warehouse felt too still. I went upstairs and stretched out on the bed, staring at the ceiling again, a habit I was getting used to. My thoughts were a mess. My parents pushing their story, investigators circling, a reporter who wanted timelines, and a forged signature that had more power than any truth I had spoken in years. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke to the sound of a car door slamming outside. For a second, panic shot through me. I sat up, heart pounding. Then I heard laughter. Not angry, not panicked, just ordinary conversation. I moved to the small window and peered out. Vince had returned with dinner. With him was someone I had seen only in passing in the building next door. Julia Sanders, the woman from the ceramics studio. She was carrying a tray of takeout cups and laughing at something Vince said. I stepped back from the window and rubbed my face. I did not have the energy to meet anyone new tonight. I could barely keep myself upright. But a few minutes later, there was a soft knock on my door. "Logan, it is Julia. I made extra soup. Thought you might want some." Her voice was warm and unsure in a way that made it hard to ignore. I opened the door. She smiled a little, not wide, just enough. "You look like you have been fighting a storm." I let out a humorless breath. "Something like that." She handed me a container and a spoon, homemade. "Vince said you might not be eating much." I nodded, unsure what else to say. She did not push. She just gave a small nod back and stepped away. "If you need anything, we are downstairs." I closed the door and stared at the soup. It smelled like chicken and herbs. It felt like the first human kindness in days. I sat on the bed and took a slow bite. Warmth spread through my chest, loosening something that had been tight for too long. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the metal siding of the warehouse. But for the first time all day, it did not make me flinch. Tomorrow would come. More calls, more fallout, more truth clawing its way into the light. But for tonight, I let myself breathe, holding the warm cup in my hands, feeling the storm settle just enough to let me think again. By the time the soup container was empty, my hands had stopped shaking. The warehouse lights hummed softly overhead, and the building settled around me like a tired animal. I slept that night for the first time in days. Not perfectly, but without waking up every 20 minutes to check my phone. Things did not get easier after that. They just became clearer. Over the next few weeks, the investigation moved from rumors and phone calls to formal letters and scheduled interviews. I met with Evelyn in her downtown office more times than I could count. She walked me through subpoenas, prepared me for questions, and reminded me, over and over, to tell the truth and only the truth. When the state investigators sat across from me in a narrow conference room, I told them exactly what I had told my supervisor years before, that the numbers looked inflated, that the documentation did not match, that I had flagged it and then watched the department close without explanation. When the SEC team spoke with me, I gave the same timeline. I did not shade it to hurt my parents, and I did not soften it to protect them. I just laid the facts on the table and let them decide what to do with them. They asked a lot of questions about my relationship with Charles and Marilyn. How often we spoke, whether I had ever confronted them directly about their decisions at Carter Dynamics, whether they had ever pressured me to change numbers or ignore problems. I answered honestly, no. They had not dragged me into their deals. They had just ignored me when I tried to warn them. Weeks turned into months. Spring came to Phoenix in that subtle way the desert has. A shift in light and a rise in temperature that sneaks up on you. I picked up small compliance contracts to pay rent and helped Vince in the warehouse when he needed extra hands. Some nights Julia would knock on my door with leftovers from her studio gatherings, and we would sit on the stairs, talking about anything but my parents. For a few hours at a time, my life felt almost normal. Then, in early May, a certified letter arrived at my apartment in Tempe. The return address said Securities and Exchange Commission. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me for a full minute before I opened it. The language was dry and official. It said that based on the evidence reviewed, there was no indication that I had knowingly participated in or benefited from the misrepresentation of assets used in the Northcrest acquisition. I was no longer considered a potential subject of enforcement. My cooperation as a witness, if required, would be voluntary. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding for months. It did not fix everything, but it took one heavy stone off my chest. News about my parents did not come by letter. It came from a link Vince texted me 2 weeks later. The headline from the Sentinel Ledger sat on my phone screen while I stood next to a pallet of boxed carburetors. Regional executives face sanctions after inflated valuations in $300 million tech deal. I opened the article. Connor had done his homework. He laid out the timeline from internal warnings to forged certifications to the rushed acquisition. He did not hold back on names. Charles and Marilyn Carter were identified as executives who had signed off on valuations that relied on flawed internal data. They were not going to prison, the story said, but they would pay heavy civil penalties and were barred from serving as officers of a public company for a decade. The company would be restructured. The big house they almost bought was already back on the market. Near the end of the article, Connor mentioned a former analyst who had flagged inconsistencies years earlier and left his position rather than certify them. My name was there, buried in the middle of a paragraph, described as someone who had tried to raise the alarm and been ignored. It was not a heroic portrait. It was just accurate. And that was enough. Within days, the calls from extended family started. First, it was Aunt Linda from Glendale, her voice shaking as she said she had read the article and could not believe what my parents had told people about me. Then my Uncle Jerome called, saying he wished he had asked my side of the story sooner. A few cousins sent texts that started with versions of "I am sorry" and moved quickly into questions about how I was doing. I answered some of them, not all. The ones who had been loudest when they thought I was the problem got silence in return. That was not revenge. That was just me choosing where to spend what little emotional energy I had left. Evelyn sent me a short email that week. She rarely used more words than necessary. "The case is closing from your angle," she wrote. "You did the hard part. Now it is your job to build something that is not defined by their choices." So I did. By fall, I had taken a permanent position with a mid-size firm in Scottsdale that specialized in data risk and compliance consulting. The pay was solid. The team was small, but serious. The first time my new boss asked my opinion on a tricky issue and actually listened to it, I almost did not know how to respond. When I told him I had concerns about a client's numbers, he did not call me paranoid. He called a meeting. I moved out of Vince's spare room and into a small but bright apartment near the Greenbelt. Mornings, I would make coffee and sit on the balcony before work, watching people walk their dogs or jog in the early light. Some evenings, Julia would drive up from Phoenix, her car still dusted with clay from the studio, and we would cook dinner together and talk about nothing that involved asset valuations or enforcement actions. We were not officially anything at first. Just two people who had shown up for each other when things were raw. That was enough. It felt steady. It felt real. My parents did not call, not for a long time. I saw their names in the news a couple more times as the civil proceedings played out. There were photos of them outside the courthouse in downtown Phoenix, walking quickly past cameras, eyes fixed straight ahead. They looked smaller, not just older, smaller, like the world had finally shown them their real size. I did not feel joy seeing that. I did not feel sorry either. What I felt was distance. A clean, necessary distance that let me breathe. The first direct contact from them came almost a year after that Christmas Eve, when they shoved my suitcase into my chest. It was a text from my mother on a random Tuesday afternoon. She wrote that they were living in a smaller place now, that my father's health had taken a hit, that they were trying to rebuild. Then came the line I had expected in some form, the one that said if I ever wanted to talk, they were still my parents. I read it 3 times. I waited for an apology that never came. She did not mention throwing me out. She did not mention asking me to lie. She did not mention telling reporters I was confused. I put the phone down on my desk and stared out the window at the Scottsdale traffic. I thought about 34 years of walking on eggshells, of trying to earn a kind word that never came without strings attached. I thought about the moment they chose money over me without blinking. Then I locked the screen and went back to my work. I never replied. That choice surprised some people when they found out. A couple of friends said that life was short and family was family. Maybe that is true for them. It is not true for everyone. Here is what I know. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not storm into a house and demand change. Sometimes it is walking away from that house and building one of your own, with people who do not ask you to bleed so they can feel comfortable. For me, that meant letting my parents live with the lives they built. It meant not setting myself on fire to keep them warm. It meant understanding that forgiveness is not the same thing as going back. I did forgive them, in my own way, not with some big speech, just in the quiet choice not to let their faces show up in my mind every time something went wrong. I forgave them enough to stop replaying every argument at 3 a.m, enough to hope, from a distance, that they someday understood the damage they had done. But I did not let them back into my life. The door stayed closed. Last Christmas, I stood on my own balcony with a cup of coffee as the sun set behind the McDowell Mountains. The air was cool and clear. In the living room behind me, the soft sound of music played while Julia wrapped a couple of last-minute gifts on the floor. Vince was on his way over with a bag of badly wrapped presents and a 6-pack he had probably grabbed at the last gas station he passed. My phone buzzed once on the table beside me, a generic holiday message from a distant relative. Nothing from my parents. I looked out at the city and realized something simple. The boy who once sat on a curb with his suitcase on Christmas Eve, wondering what he had done wrong, was gone. In his place stood a man who finally understood that other people's choices were not his burden to carry. If you have ever been the one holding the weight for everybody else, the one people blame when their own shortcuts catch up with them, maybe some part of this sounds familiar. Maybe you have been the quiet person in the corner who noticed the cracks before anyone else, the one they called negative until the ceiling fell. All I can say is this: you are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to say this far and no further. You are allowed to choose people who choose you back. And if this story hits a little too close to home, if it stirred something you have been trying to ignore, stick around and share your own story. There are more nights like this to talk through, more endings and new beginnings to lay out on the table. And sometimes hearing someone else's mess laid bare is the first step to finally clearing your own.